historically, we're now doing a setup in Barbarossa that features all of the Russian units deployed within their military districts. Okay, and those military districts did have an actual, allocation of forces to it. For the game, we're not going to do that. Okay, there's going to be a freedom of action of the player to be able to choose in that military district. But what the military district assures is like, this one was pretty strong and it has a formidable defense. This one, not so much. And so, historically, the Germans were able to break through from here to here in the first week of the game at game terms. Right? Yesterday we had two situations actually where we got that far. Okay, and that's a good calibration. This city here, this is better defended, and the strength in this military district is such that we can make this very hard to get to. So despite the distance, that could still fall on turn one. Despite the short distance here, this might last a couple of turns. The Russian wants to delay the German. It's all about slowing the German down. It's a juggernaut. The Germans are going to be playing with powerful counters. And what you'll see when you look at them, you'll compare the numbers just looking, and it's like, wow, that is a powerful force, right? So as the German force penetrates, look at this distance right here, right? When it's congested in this space, it's very dense and very strong. Come out here in a couple of months, and we're doubling that. And that's exactly what happened to the Germans in real life. As they start spreading their forces thinner and thinner, it's easier for the Soviets to put up blocking actions. Right? The Germans will historically do what they try to do historically, which is encircle. And then, the Russians have counters for this. I don't mean physical counters, I mean they have counter strategies, right? And that's one of the things that we'll talk about as we go through this today. And tomorrow, there's going to be options, and we're going to want to bring your attention to that. Here's an innovative approach, that Kevin comes up with. It involves air and mechanized units, and we'll show you how they can bedevil German offensive plans. So despite, overwhelming power, the game is really very well balanced. They calibrate against the history. What they don't want, and the design team has shared this with us, they don't want players to feel constrained by the history. The game is calibrated to put it in a bounds, a box, right? And now within that box, the players still have options to make their own choices that can reshape the history. Right? That's fun. Right? You don't want to, the more detail you put into these, the more these become conflict simulations, then you start to see that the only possible result of the game is the history. Well, I read it in the history book. I know what's going to happen. Why play that? That's no good. So this game strikes a good balance of historical credibility and then freedom of action by the player to do something innovative that changes history. It's cool. And Kevin, would you agree?
Yeah, it gives a very good flavor, and we've got enough choices that we can choose different options than what the armies historically did. We can consider, well, what happens if, as the Axis, we focus on a northern route or on a southern route and put more focus there than we did in previously.
Well, you're showing a historical, or not a historical, you're showing one of your own innovations right now. Why don't you explain what's going on with the colored blocks?
Yeah, so the Soviet units for setup, and this is true in all the scenarios, are divided into frontline units and reserve units. And the frontline units have to be along the front line. For Barbarossa, it's going to be the borders that existed at that time. There are other lines further back, for other scenarios where it's the same thing. There's frontline units that will be on that front line, and then there's reserves that need to be deployed to cover the major cities, the supply cities, and the likes of Moscow and Gorky and Stalingrad. We need to have reserves in all those cities And the rest of the reserves were free to set up so long as they're at least 6 hexes away from the front, which I think is 300 miles in scale, something like that.
Something like that.
And so the line I've laid out here of blocks, that's 5 hexes. So the reserves cannot be where the blocks are, unless it's an important city like, this,
That's a port city.
this port city, or Odessa, or Chisinau. We can put reserves in there because they're important cities. But otherwise, they need to be in cities somewhere on this side of the front. I filled in, said, well, we'll have mech corps in a bunch of these little towns in the Pripyat March. And I think we'll need the last couple in the north here somewhere. So maybe I'll put one there and one there. And so these are where the units would have been, these reserve units could have been located in mid to late June of 41 when this is setting off.
That's right. And here's an interesting rationale. Why are there so many of those mech corps down here versus very few of them up there? Right? Any of your viewers are going to appreciate that there is a value to a mechanized unit. It's going to have more mobility, right? So it can get around, and it's like a cavalry or anything else. It's going to be able to extend its influence over a long distance and add a punch to it. Infantry is going to slog it out on the line. The reason there's more mech down here is because when you study the objectives, and so take a look at Minsk, for example. Notice how there's a highlight here. These red highlights around this will indicate to the players that this is an objective city, and the invading player is going to get points for that. So if you study the objectives, there's a lot of them that come down this way. Historically, this is the Donbass region, so this was heavy industry for the Soviet Union before the Germans invaded, before they moved it back to the Urals. This is a sweet prize. As Alan likes to say, this is the honeypot, right? In addition to the Donbass, you now have the Caucasus oil fields. And this is why the Battle of Stalingrad was fought, for the Germans to drive down here and get these resources. So it's very logical in the game to play to win. Well, we don't want that on the recording. Ignore what's going on in the background. The German looks at these objectives and says, for my limited resources, I can do more with it down here. So it's likely that they're going to put more mobile forces. Their panzer forces are going to come south. The only thing you can do to stop that is to keep delaying them with your own mobile counterpunches. That's part of the strategy of the game. Yes, if you can get a blocking force put up, that's great. The Russian usually runs short of that infantry. He's got to bring it to the line. So it's a tough trade-off, but the Russian has to save these mech units so that as the German starts to penetrate, hit them back, slow them down that way. You want to prevent the Germans from getting to these, because if they seize those resources, they get to start drawing oil. They get to start drawing equipment points, right? So it takes time in the game to turn that around into German production, but it happens. We've played it where this actually occurs. So that's the backstory as to why, as a Russian, we would want to have more reserve like that here in the Ukraine than up in the northern part of the map. There are important historical objectives like Leningrad and Moscow, but those were, from an economic point of view, not as demanding, right? Now you're getting back to the caprice of dictators saying, I want to take the thing with Lenin's name on it. I want to take Moscow. I want to take the name with Stalin's name on it. The game doesn't really lend itself to that. It's not going to constrain players by saying, oh, you're forced to go take that. There are options to be aggressive in the north, in the center, and in the south. It's up to the players to decide which ones are going to make the most sense for them, for a strategic point of view, and as well for just the fun of it. Right? I don't want to do the things that the Germans did that was stupid, or that the Russians did that was stupid. Right? I want that freedom of action to make smarter choices. And the design from the design team has accommodated that. That's a good feature. So, as part of Kickstarter, the plan is to provide 2 scenario options for every game. One of those is going to be the historical setup, which we explained earlier. This is kind of what we're doing. There's some freedom to change what's in the military district from hex to hex, but you follow what's required and allowed by that military district. In other scenarios in the game, whether it's Citadel, Operation Uranus, Case Blue, there will be an option to play a hex by hex. Here's what's identified historically that was there, and you'll get to play it from that. There'll also be the option to come back to the military district or Army Group Center or some organizational entity like that and say, now I'm going to give you the freedom. You play the option and set your Army Group Center up the same, in a way that's innovative for you. Right? So there's nothing that would require the Germans to drive to Stalingrad. They could say instead, I want to drive to Voronezh and Moscow and take this area, and have shorter lines. Shorter lines means a denser force and a stronger force. Okay? I don't make the Führer's mistakes, right? And the same thing goes for the Russian. When the Russian plays in the early war, Stalin ordered many counterattacks that cost the lives of a lot of Russian soldiers. They would be largely stupid in this game. You're just throwing your stuff away. Incidentally, the combat table accounts for that. This combat table has a historical representation to it, and we'll give you examples of combat in action as we actually do it. But if you notice here in some of these low odds attacks, which is what's going to happen when the Russians are fighting back in the early war, whether it's 1-2, 1-1, or a 3-2, there's something called an AL result. That's the attacker loses. Nothing happens to the defender. It's the attacker that suffers. That's there to represent those historical cases that had forces been desperate enough and had to push no matter what. There's high odds that they're going to fail. Okay, by the same token, on the inverse side, when you look at that combat results table, there's action in it. We'll explain as the game goes on and other times, but that magic AO, that's an attacker option. That's where the attacker is going to get to push defenders out of the way, and so even when it's long odds, you might find an opportunity to get what you want, to change the strategic position, if you will. So.